Stories of life told by photographers.
This path that I'm walking along now is a path I regularly walk, and you've been with me along making these Photowalk podcasts. In the week I've been away, I've been to Austria, and the week I've been away, I can notice the growth of the grass, the nettles. This path is almost impassable, usually come around about June, mid-June perhaps. And where are we? March? No, not March, April. The months pass so quickly, and it's getting toward that stage. Whoa. So, yeah, last week I was in Austria. That's why there was no programme. I've missed you. Where have you been? Well, I've been in Austria. There was an extra mile from Austria, and I'll make sure to tell you a bit about that later on, because that programme is up. It's quite it's a bit of a special, actually. There's specials 2 weeks in a row, actually, with the Photowalk. But I was in Austria and recorded a programme while I was there. Now, this is I'm making the programme the evening before this goes out, so it's Thursday night. Just between you and me. Don't tell anybody else, because that's the magic of radio and podcasting. There's still people who believe this is absolutely live. I know that's not you. That'll probably be my other listener. But let me put my notes down there, my thoughts, and get a picture of this late evening sunshine, which is beautiful. I'm going to shoot straight into it. I'm on the X100V F5, I think, yeah. 1/60th, straight into the sunshine. In fact, if I want some flair, let's go for F8. F8, straight into the sunshine. There's some flair. Beautiful. Fantastic. A sketchbook image to start the walk today. The landing, I tell you what, at Heathrow, the landing. Oh dear, it's been very windy across the UK the last few days, hasn't it? Yes, it has, Neil. We were coming in and it was all over the shop. There was a passenger hyperventilating into a bag, one seat in front of me. And I was secretly hoping, though, that we might do a go-around. I've never been on an aircraft that has to do a go-around. Apparently, it's very exciting. So I was sat there thinking, this is wobbling about a bit. We're bound to have a go-around. The passenger was hyperventilating increasingly more. I was convinced this was my go-around, although you're only allowed one at Heathrow, apparently. If you come in the second time and you do a go-around, they send you on somewhere else. You end up 138 miles away from where your car was parked or something. What is it with you Brits and the weather? But it's nice to be back with you. It's nice to be back in the UK, and we have a very special show today.
The Photowalk is brought to you by mpb.com. Quality used photo and video kit. Buy, sell, trade, create at mpb.com.
I've been using MPB for a few lens purchases of late. Latest for me, the 16 to 55mm for my Fuji X-H2S, my Fujifilm X-H2S. I've been using the 18 to 55, the not-so-kit lens for a while, but I've been really impressed with the 1655 when I've used it. But before I start going too tech, and we all get a nosebleed talking about 9-blade diaphragms, step size and lens configurations, I thought you might be interested to know that mpb.com now has its own camera backpack called the Brunswick. If you're like me, a camera bag collector or hoarder, as Sam says, then here's another one to hoard. I shall leave a link on the show page, and perhaps we'll take it for a test drive in the next month or so. But on that note, I think I've found the perfect word to hide my penchant for camera bag purchases. and that is curating. I am no longer hoarding or purchasing. I am curating my collection. Aha! And I want to now pass that baton to you. It's my Northern Hemisphere spring gift, if you like, to you. You can use this in whatever guise, context or purpose. That's not just another pair of jeans with the knees shot through that I want to keep, though I know I'll never wear them again, darling. No, I'm curating a collection of jeans, which is my way of introducing what should have been one of our Photowalk editions, where I walk with my guest side by side instead of being on Zoom, and the letters in the mailbag being, of course, the walking element of the show. No, I do go physically to meet my guest today, Hilary Roberts, former head curator of the Photographic Archive at the Imperial War Museum. That is quite the job when it's your responsibility to curate history photographically for generations to come to learn from. You know, this photo walk can sometimes take different forms, and today, it's a history show as much a photography show, as we walk and listen back together, if you like. One I've been waiting to record for quite a while, this edition, around about 3 years, nearly, or best part of 3 years. My contact with Hilary, my guest, has been resting in an inbox, maturing, if you like, waiting for the right moment. Anyway, so yes, we were going to go walking and recording, but instead of walking, we had to surrender to 40-mile-an-hour winds and driving rain, and instead recorded the interview at Hilary's home, which is, I suppose, in this case, roughly, or trying desperately to shoehorn it into the start of, or the introduction to the show. It's a kind of, it's the interviewing version of, I suppose, a go-around. Now, war is a spiky, awkward subject for many people, for very obvious and often very personal reasons. But this is a program not solely about war, as you're about to discover, but it is a difficult subject. It is an awkward topic to navigate around and through, and I'm acutely aware when I look through the stats of where this show is listened to. We get heard in some areas, some countries, some regions who are effectively at war right now, or in conflict, or have troubles, or are enduring a special operation, which I find a sobering thought. You know, my worries today consist of whether I've got time to head out for a family meal tonight, because it's publishing night for this program. I've not finished half the amount of editing preparing I was hoping to by now. And whilst in a place 600 miles from where I was last week, walking in beautiful mountains, stopping to photograph and enjoy the absolute peace and quiet, and also the fresh natural water streams from which I could drink. 600 miles from there, last week where I was, there is this special operation still inflicting utter misery for reasons that I find unfathomable. I can't comprehend, and it leaves me in complete bewildered state. But my guest, Hilary Roberts, has for 4 decades had the responsibility, and it's an awesome responsibility to curate and oversee and acquire and research conflict. And granted, her base or desk or Rolodex has been on a desk in London, but conflict's tentacles mean that her work, or focus of life, if you will, is and has been truly international, historically so. If you look up Hilary Roberts in her LinkedIn profile, you'll see under specialities, history of war and conflict photography and the history of modern conflict. I'd say she spent much of her life metaphorically on a front line, preserving collections of pictures that we may encounter, sometimes endure, and hopefully learn from, that's been so carefully, thoughtfully, and painfully at times, I'm sure, curated. Quote, "You can't go around kidding yourself that your photographs in a few papers will change the world. They can't, and they haven't. I despair about the human race. The press only shows the bums, the killers, and the arms dealers and people like that. Good news is never sold in newspaper. Don McCullin said that. And he also laments, we haven't changed a thing. Once war is over, you can bet your life there'll be another tragedy in my lifetime. We'll not see the end of war and suffering. I know he laments that he doesn't feel the photographs, the stories he's made, the narratives have necessarily changed anything for the better. It's one of the most potent quotes from photography, and a few guys is echoed by many of his famous peers. And it's interesting to note that he is a personal friend of Hilary Roberts, and it's a discussion they've had. And you'll expect me to ask her about that, as indeed we'll also learn of her first meeting with him before they were friends, in a corridor, a somewhat, I think the word would be fraught first contact, if I may use a word that's often actually used in conflict. So there's lots to talk about today. A history programme. Yes, that's what I believe this one is today. It's a very different show, and we do talk about war in Europe with references to now close neighbours who were once sitting across a, very different table in terms of understanding, beliefs and thought processes. I'll try to navigate that conversation in the production of this programme, particularly when we come to the end of today's show, right at the end, which was rather unexpected in terms of an answer to a question that I asked Hilary, because we end with the most, and I mean most, extraordinary story of resilience, of courage, of determination, of human endeavour. I never ask the question, what is your favourite picture? Or if I do, I reframe it in such a way that my guest wouldn't think that they're just turned up to day one elementary interviewing class. But I am, and I'm going to use the A word, and I hardly ever use the A word, you know that. I save it for particularly important occasions, deserving occasions. But I am in awe of the revelation and the story that Hilary shares with me at the end of today's programme. So much so, I've shared it with everybody, including my kids, that I've had a chance to talk to personally with, probably in the last 48 hours or so. And by the time you hear these words, for me, and I genuinely mean this, this story is on my figurative bookshelf of stories that I will remember until the day I go to look for Henri Cartier-Bresson to shoot the breeze with, looking down upon the Parisian streets he loved so much.
Today on the Photowalk.
At the time I was helping Spike Milligan with his biography, and Spike was quite inclined to make joke calls. And so, I thought, hang on, this is a Spike Milligan. I basically said, eek, and leapt out of his way, and he went straight on past. And that was the first time I'd seen how fast he could move.
Stories of life told by photographers, and today we're joined as you and I walk by a curator, historian, and a photographer in a special edition. Everyone is a photographer on this walk, whatever camera you use, and that includes the not-so-humble smartphone, because this is a show about how making photos has you feel, what it does for us and others around us. There are no letters, though, today. They return in a couple of weeks' time, but by the end of the show, we'll have learned what curating photography for museums and collections means, and hear the most incredible historical story of courage and determination. Nearly 7 billion people on this planet are able to make a photograph with something and record life. So we're not walking alone documenting our place and time in this world. Checklist out. Coffee and Garibaldi's and walking boots on? Check. Well, let's walk and listen to Hilary Roberts.
Hilary, a career in curation. Now, I know what a curator is. I understand the word. But it's far more than just simply taking material and putting it in some kind of order so that viewers and listeners may understand it. It's a lot more involved.
So curatorship has got many aspects to it, and people's understanding of it varies not only across the realm of public opinion, but also between institutions. Curators in institutions worldwide do not all do the same thing. In my case, I define curation as being a bridge between the past and the present. My role is to make the material relevant, comprehensible, available to whoever wants to use it and access it for any reason whatsoever. And so you have to be very empathetic. You are sometimes cast in the role of representing a photographer to their audience. Photographers take bodies of work. They have a distinct concept or purpose in mind. Usually they may have a style, they may have an objective. But what is very often the case is that over time their work acquires a patina which may be quite different to what was originally intended. But one of the roles of curatorship is to be able to make sure that that is appreciated and taken into account. A curator does not have to be associated with a museum. There are many freelance or independent curators. After 42 years, I am now an independent curator, but prior to that, I curated the photograph collections of the Imperial War Museum. I joined the museum in 1980 and I retired in December 2020.
But you've not really retired, of course. Now, being an independent curator, you're straight back in the fold.
Well, one of the things about curators is that I think they never truly retire.
No.
And I think it's exactly the same for photographers.
Yeah.
Photography is a wonderfully generous medium.
Yes.
And it means a great deal to everyone. And that is, for me, an absolute joy. Photography has taken me to places that I never expected. And now it's opening a new phase in my life, and I'm looking to see where it takes me.
I'll let you into a little secret. As I pulled up, well, before I pulled up, I was thinking on my way over in the car, because originally we were going to record this on one of your favourite walks, but it's blowing an absolute hoolie today, and I didn't want to return with 2 pieces of Hillary, having had a tree fall across us or something. But I thought, when I go in the house then, in this case, I wonder what a curator hangs in their house. And so while you were making a cup of tea, I was looking around. I was expecting to see lots of photographs, but there aren't.
Well, I can, instead of a walk around the park, I can take you on a walk around my house. But every curator has their library. So we're currently sitting in my living room, which is the room I use to decompress.
Ah, right.
So when you are working, as I did for so long, with images of conflict, you need to, just like a photographer does, you need to look after yourself. And you need to have to find a way of coming to terms with that experience. So this room that we're sitting in is designed to actually help me step aside a little bit from that. But in another room, it's rammed full of my library of books on conflict photography and history, military history, in conflict in general. And other rooms have photographs on the wall. Photographs usually that have personal significance by photographers I've worked with who have become, not only professional colleagues, but personal friends.
Yeah.
And so the house is certainly curated. It's a joke with my family and friends that I am constantly curating my garden, But what you are doing is you are deciding what has significance, and you are, in the case of my home, I'm deciding what has significance to me and my family. In the case of a photography collection, you are deciding what has significance or potential significance to its audience. So curatorship is really about subjugating your personal opinions and ego to the audience that you are trying to reach, but while also representing and maintaining the integrity of the photographer's work and their intentions. When I began at Imperial War Museum back in the 1980s, the First World War generation was still very much with us.
Yeah.
And that was an immense privilege. They have now passed away. But the conversations I had with photographers, professional and amateur, whom I was lucky enough to come into contact with, very much in my head. There is no doubt I feel a certain responsibility to those photographers.
It appears to me, and you mentioned the word responsibility, that's a very heavy burden, because you are effectively, I might be approaching this too simply, but you're in essence the gatekeeper for what those in the future will see. You can't keep everything.
Yes, that's true. When I started out, the responsibility was very individual. And so building a collection, when I started out, the Imperial War Museum's photograph collections numbered some 5 million images. When I left, it was well over 11 million images. In the intervening time, I think I was working through at least a dozen conflicts, which had direct impact on the United Kingdom. And of course, we were working through conflicts involving the United States, Europe, the Soviet Union as was, and Russia as is now. And so that responsibility was something that one learnt very, very quickly. These days, what has changed is that perhaps that in the case of IWM, and I think it's also true in the case of many museums these days, the procedures involved in acquiring photographs for the permanent collections are no longer a matter of individual responsibility. So, the first thing to do when you are assessing a collection of photography or an archive is to really get a very good sense of not only what it holds, but why it was put together, what the purpose was, and how does one represent that purpose in the long term.
2 years into your arrival at the Imperial War Museum, this happens.
After several days of rising tension in our relations with Argentina, that country's armed forces attacked the Falkland Islands yesterday and established military control of the islands.
Argentina today invaded and seized the Falkland Islands, which have been under British rule for nearly 150 years.
I have to confirm that an Argentine military attack on Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands has taken place.
Argentina claimed recovery of the Falklands hours before the British government admitted the invasion had taken place.
I wish that it had not gone forward. I understand they have landed there, and I did talk to the president of Argentina and trying to persuade him not to go forward with that.
The Falklands conflict, of which you've spoken about, I know, extensively on stages, in interviews. I remember it. I was at secondary school then. I remember that very, very well. It only lasted, 74 days. But the importance of it in terms of photographic and also strategic terms is immense, isn't it?
Yes. The Falklands conflict was a short conflict between the professional army of the United Kingdom and what was a mixed professional conscript force of Argentina over British overseas territories in the South Atlantic. That include not only the Falklands, but also South Georgia. And these territories had had no indigenous populations prior to their being taken over by the British. But the strategic value of them was quite considerable. But most crucially, over a period of 200 years, a population of British origin had settled there, and the conflict was rooted around their wishes. Now, Argentina has always felt that it had a valid claim to these territories, and in terms of geographical proximity, you can understand their point of view. For a whole host of reasons, this conflict took Britain by surprise. I was a junior curator at the time, and my role within the Imperial War Museum Photograph Archive had up till that point been exclusively concerned with photographs of the two world wars. So this, for me personally and professionally, was something not only completely new, but also very unexpected. And it started with my walking in on an office discussion about how the museum should refer in public to what was happening. This was as the task force was sailing south. You know, sort of various terms were tossed around: war, emergency, occupation, crisis.
There's irony when you consider
Yes.
the different words being bandied around to describe Ukraine.
Absolutely. And this was my first experience with the point that the language that we use in terms of describing conflict and war has resonance beyond the immediate. So somebody said to me, I asked after listening to this debate for a while, why don't we just call it a war? Seems to be a war to me. Can we not talk about a war? And it was explained to me rather gently that Britain was a member of NATO, and that if we called it a war, the NATO countries would be involved, and also that war has international law attached to it, and that would mean that it would dictate how civilians from Britain in Argentina and Argentinians in Britain would be treated. Somebody sort of said, well, you realise we would have to intern the stars of Tottenham Hotspur football
There
team.
were two players there, weren't there?
Yes, there were.
Ozzy Ardiles being one of the most famous footballers in this country. Yeah.
Absolutely. So anyway, the key thing was that we were directed within the museum to call it a conflict, and the government, in its terminology, still officially refers to it as a conflict. I genuinely feel more comfortable talking about conflict in terms of what I do than consistently talking about war. Because you can have, war doesn't necessarily mean confrontation between the professional forces of two governments. Northern Ireland, we seem to have become comfortable with the Troubles. Conflict is conflict. It involves considerable suffering. Photographs of conflict do not necessarily mean photographs of frontline battle. Photographs of conflict can be personal, professional, they can be informational, they can be art, they can be propaganda, they can be science and technology. A sort of photograph of a radar screen trace, for example, or a sound trace. One of the really exciting discoveries that I made 10 years ago in the archive was an image of a sound trace on 35mm film, which shows the moment that the guns fell silent on the Western Front in 1918.
Oh, my word.
And this technology involved British sound locators, which were used to help target artillery, French imaging technology, and American opportunism, saying, hey, this is a great event, let's actually use this technology to record the moment the guns fall silent.
Yeah.
And so even sound can be imaged. And in this case, that is as valid an image of conflict.
I want to rewind slightly into our conversation and the terminology, because it did strike me, Northern Ireland Troubles, conflict, war, special operation, all these different terms, whether the Imperial War Museum ever found itself in an awkward situation then of being labelled a war museum with such an important international archive of photographs. Could it have been the Imperial Conflict Museum?
The Imperial War Museum was established in 1917 in the context of the First World War. That was technically a war in the sense that the legal protocols about declaring war and so forth had actually been followed.
Yes.
So everybody in that context was talking about war. Yeah. And the museum was conceived initially as the National War Museum, and its aim was initially to document and record, preserve the story of Britain's, as it was then put, endurance, sacrifice, and, the role in that particular conflict.
Right.
And so for a short period of time, it was known as the British National, or the National War Museum.
Yeah.
But Britain wasn't just an island nation. At that point in time, it had an empire. And the empire troops, many of whom were first-generation settlers in Australia, Canada, South Africa, and India, were also fighting and dying and making sacrifices. And the same applies actually to Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was a time of empires. And so the British government under Lloyd George was reminded by Australia, Canada and the others that it wasn't just Britain at that point, and they would like to be represented too, please. And so by Act of Parliament, the Imperial War Museum came into being. And since then, Britain is no longer an empire. No. There is a Commonwealth, but equally, IWM no longer is a one-conflict institution. The First World War was hoped that it would be the war to end all wars. That is the origins of the term the Great War. The rise of Hitler and the advent of the Second World War, of course, changed all that. The advent of NATO, the fact that conflict itself has changed, and sometimes conflicts never exist in a formal state. What we call asymmetric conflict, which means conflict which is between groups which don't necessarily recognize national boundaries, and also between forces of different power and scale. So, what you might call sometimes guerrilla warfare or terrorism or whatever.
What about the Cold War in that case?
Which is an interesting one, because the Cold War was...
That's not a war in terms of the way you describe it, in terms of the boundaries and language that war must have.
Well, it speaks to the point that conflict takes many forms, but also the fact that many of the actual conflicts which took place during the Cold War were partly conflicts involving national identity. So, the conflict in Malaya, for example, Kenya, the Mau Mau, Vietnam, obviously, Cambodia. These conflicts, on one level, were about a nation's right to self-determination and freedom from imperial control. But because of the geopolitical realities, they also became spheres of influence between the superpowers. And so they were also part of this confrontation between the then Soviet Union and the United States and their allies. And so you end up with a very complex situation, which is many, many things, which today we call the Cold War, just for ease of reference.
Yeah. The photographic collection from that period must include international pictures, I would imagine, from both sides of the so-called curtain as well.
Yes, it does. And the scale of the Cold War is vast. And it's one reason why it's very difficult to pin down in a short conversation. It's generally understood through the lens of the nuclear arms race, and also through the confrontation in Germany, which was split in two. It can also be seen in terms of culture, sport, and technology, espionage. So the Cold War deserves far more attention than it has had, and it is beginning to get that now. But for many years, it was sort of completely overshadowed by the story of the two world wars, which were far easier to actually grasp in terms of what it was about, what the events were, and in terms of the photography. You could have a photograph of a ballerina dancing on the stage, Rudolf Nureyev, dancing on the stage at Covent Garden. And on one level, that is nothing to do with conflict. And on another level, it's a Cold War photograph. Likewise, the confrontation or the chess tournament between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky, that is Cold War.
Spassky is pacing, he's nervous, and...
Wait, here comes Fischer, coming on the stage, saying that he was caught in traffic. And I think Spassky was visibly relieved.
And also perhaps pained.
it didn't look like this match would happen, but finally it happened. And it was phenomenal.
How do you spell relief, okay?
Now, for the first time, we're looking at Bobby Fischer, the man that 8 times has won the United States Open Championship.
I remember saying on TV at one point during the match, I said, we're really lucky to be alive at this moment when Bobby Fischer is playing Boris Spassky.
Photographs take many forms when it comes to conflict.
A colleague of mine loves to talk about the slipperiness of photography, and I think slippery is one of the challenges. There are 2 challenges with curating archives of photography and archives of conflict photography in particular. One is sort of everybody wishes to put something in a pigeonhole, but with this genre, it often doesn't fit very comfortably, and you do yourself a disservice if you try to define too narrowly what is going on. And the second thing is, the unique advantage of photography is that it is not unique. A picture, if somebody asks me to define in terms of an artifact what a war photograph or a conflict photograph actually is, I then reel off a whole list of items. So you start off with, in the case of a historic photograph, the negative that came out the camera. And then in many circumstances, you would have to deal with the duplicate negative which was made at that time immediately, partly for safekeeping, partly for ease of use. Then you have the print, which the first generation print, and then you have the censored print. Then you get onto the caption, because a caption is an integral part of a photograph. Photography has endless fascinations to it, and now we're talking obviously about the digital age, and we're talking about the era of AI, which is just coming over the horizon into the field. And here we have challenges which relate to authority, believability, authenticity, but also creativity. And you can see that there are some challenges, some very significant challenges, and also some very significant opportunities and advantages.
Hilary, we appear to be, every time you go forward, and you've mentioned AI, I'm pulling you back and back. But I do want to go back to the First World War, the Great War, because something I noted through your LinkedIn profile, actually, was that you'd been part of a panel, a talk, recognising the work of women photographers in the First World War. Now, I wasn't aware of a plethora of women photographers during the First World War.
By contrast, this is I have always been aware. However, I would say again a question which I received very often in my career. Quite often what would happen would be a phone call from a student saying, "I've been asked to do a piece of research about war photographers," and then they reel off the following list, which is Roger Fenton, Robert Capa, and Don McCullen. Bang. Then I sort of start to break this down a bit. But the fact of the matter is that photography has always been open to women. It is one of the very few professions, certainly in the Western world, where women have always had the chance to work professionally in photography. Photography was seen as a respectable outlet for women, akin to sketching and art and drawing in the Victorian era, when it obviously came on to general awareness. And so, some of the very earliest women photographers, Julia Margaret Cameron, Anna Atkins, and so forth, were directly involved in photography. Professional photography was definitely something that women who were looking for a means of supporting their family embraced when technology advanced to the point that it was possible to do so. So a key development was the development of the postcard industry. Another key development was the ability to reproduce photographs in newspapers and books, at which point women could actually contemplate working professionally in photography. They were already working as often assistants, and the role of female assistants in photographic studios
Yeah.
is an area which is really only just beginning to be studied. But in the decade prior to the First World War, women were beginning to work under their own names in professional photography. By the time that the war broke out in 1914, there were women who were capable.
Yeah.
But the question was, would they be allowed to? The issue here was the presence of women in combat zones. Women who worked in the medical professions from really the very earliest days of the war were allowed to be present in combat zones. But journalists, professional journalists, were not of either gender. But as the war progressed and the question of substitution and freeing men up to fight came along, women did get more opportunity. I should also mention that the decade before the First World War was the era of the suffrage campaign, the campaign for votes for women.
Yes.
And so, there were many women who may not have been active in that campaign, but, they certainly wanted to consider using photography. So in Germany, Austria-Hungary, the UK, there were women who did take photographs which documented consequences of war, and in a few cases they were close enough to the front line that they could actually photograph the events of the front line.
Is this, when you talk about the consequences and propaganda, is this where the military in particular started to get, and government actually, started to get just a bit twitchy about the reality of seeing not war artists' paintings, but the real consequence of battle? And how much of that, in that case, did we not end up seeing because of that?
Yes. So, I mean, the concern amongst military authorities in every country dates back much further than the First World War. Britain and the British Army was the first military force to actually recruit, train and use photographers in uniform. So it was possible to be a British Army photographer from the 1850s.
Right.
One of the reasons why Roger Fenton ended up in the Crimea was that an earlier contingent of the Royal Engineers photographers, their ship had sunk. And so there was, the War Office's project, which was at that point to get photographs for military use from the battlefield in the Crimea, didn't work, and Roger Fenton was allowed to go. But Roger Fenton was a civilian, and therefore military controls was something that he was subject to. Things like no dead bodies. Now, the next step was the concern in the aftermath of the photographs of the American Civil War by Matthew Brady's studio. From that point, it was felt that civilian photographers who were not subject to military controls were a problem. Lord Kitchener, in the colonial wars, essentially called them scum.
Oh.
So, when he was fighting in Sudan, the Battle of Omdurman, journalists with cameras and their behaviour were such that by the time the First World War came around, he was very opposed to civilian press photographers having any access to the front whatsoever. There were practical concerns when it came to the Navy and the ships, because you have a photographer with very bulky equipment on board a ship where space is at a premium. But again, the question of whether photographs could influence and give away military secrets was a leading concern. Propaganda in the First World War in 1914 and 15 was largely understood by everybody in terms of text. One of the things it's hard to remember is that schooling and literacy were relatively new developments throughout the Western world. The ability of people to be able to read and write was very limited, and therefore in terms of propaganda, what eventually became the British Ministry of Information in the First World War was very focused on responding to people's newfound literacy. So they focused on text and writing propaganda, forgetting that a picture, the cliche says, is worth 1,000 words, but also can very much overcome any language barriers. I mean, this is how I became aware myself as a university student of the power of photography. I was in Prague in what was then Czechoslovakia in 1977, just as Václav Havel was starting his Charter 77 movement, which would ultimately end up with the independence of Czechoslovakia. But I came across a small pop-up exhibition of photographs, which were captioned all in Czech, which, far too many Zs for me to make sense of. But I could absolutely make sense of the message.
Yeah.
And I could also see that while this particular little display in the open air in a street was actually, telling the story of, on one level, Russia coming to the rescue of the Czech people, it was also making the point that the Czech people themselves have a say in their future, and they are not. They have a unique culture and perspective on events. So, that was the point where I, as a person who spoke no Czech, completely got the message. So the First World War was when an infrastructure was developed in terms of censorship and control. It was also the point in which the understanding of the importance of truth in conflict photography and the concept of the documentary image in any form also became established. So manipulation and falsification in conflict photographs from the First World War, it happened, but it was questioned, and it became, by the end of the war, it was far less publicly acceptable. And so when the documentary film movement came along in the 1930s, and sort of people like Robert Capa and so forth were photographing the Spanish Civil War, they were building on the foundations of these lessons of the First World War. So that is why I do tend to think that when you are talking about the origins of anything, you have to look at the context.
You mentioned Capa. I'm going to ask because he would certainly feature within my understanding of what makes one of these. Your understanding and your context may well be different when I ask you the question, what makes an iconic image?
Gosh.
In the context of conflict here.
Yes, in the context of conflict. Well, first of all, the word iconic is much overused, but it does have weight, and there are certain photographs, such as Nick Ut's Napalm Girl, which is perhaps the world's best-known photograph taken in a conflict, where those that don't have an intimate knowledge of photography know exactly what you're talking about. The photograph has currency. The image itself has to summarize what we understand that the elements of that conflict to mean. So, it may have a positive or a negative mood to it. Quality is not, I would say, essential, but it has to encapsulate everything that we understand that particular conflict to mean. So whether, Robert Capa's photograph of, a handful of photographs of the American landings on Omaha Beach, which are very blurred, but, were used and have inspired films such as, Saving Private Ryan. But how do they become iconic? And this is where it becomes far more complex. One of the elements of this is the media, the press, who are rushing to deadlines, and they have a certain photograph which is to hand, which is also embedded in their memory, and they in turn embed it in ours. And a second element, which is my personal opinion, is that an iconic photograph of conflict often benefits from having footage to back it up, to contextualize it. In other words, and this goes down to sort of how does your memory work? Because a still image has an incredible power to embed itself in your memory and act as a first point of recall. Recalling footage or text, the brain struggles. Yeah. It's more effort. And so when I say naked girl running down the road, that is the point that the brain pulls out. The fact that that particular photograph was captured by news teams, television news teams, which actually gives the context to that, gives it a sense of authenticity, believability. The British have a photograph which is used to summarise the Falklands conflict, which is of the Marine, Peter Robinson, with a Union Jack flying from the radio set which he is carrying on his back, about setting off across the Falklands on the march to Port Stanley.
It's a very familiar image. Yeah.
It's a very familiar image. And it was shot by a guy called Pete Holgate. He shot it in colour, in black and white, and there was also footage. So sometimes what makes an iconic photograph in war is not only one that summarises all the context and what we believe we understand by that war, rightly or wrongly, but also because the footage is there to confirm what we think we know.
Yeah.
So the question which I often throw back is we have a canon of iconic conflict photographs which cover the first half of the 20th century and elements of the Cold War. But since the advent of digital photography and the conflicts that they have covered, if I were to throw back to you, give me your thoughts on an iconic image from the conflict in Afghanistan.
I was hoping you were going to ask for a different conflict, and I was going to talk about the famous finger wagging in Iraq, of which actually I don't think there is a moving image.
No.
I wonder if I wonder if I'm filling in I've often said this with photography, that you can mistakenly think you've seen a picture move.
Yes, I mean, it's not essential for footage to be there. I would say, sort of one of the images which has embedded itself in our consciousness from Iraq are the photographs of Abu Ghraib.
Yes.
But I ask about Afghanistan because for me, what we might call an iconic image really has yet to emerge. What tends to be used in that
it's interesting because I had a reticence to answer that question because I couldn't think of one.
No.
And you're saying you don't believe one necessarily exists.
Exactly. I think that's the case. I mean, I would give you an example of the type of photograph which tends to come up, which is usually a group of ISAF soldiers, varying nationalities, with a helicopter kicking up a dust storm. A single standout image which encapsulates what we understand by the West's engagement in Afghanistan is not there.
Taking it a step in a slightly different direction, from iconic photography to iconic art, can conflict, pictures, photographs that is, be art?
Yes, this is again coming back to the point about the slipperiness of photography.
Yes.
And I genuinely feel that documentary images can serve as art forms, and art photographs which respond to conflict or created in the context of conflict and have something to say.
I suppose a commentary.
Yeah, can tell us more about a particular conflict sometimes than a single still image, because in some cases there are some aspects of war which it is very difficult to visualize, to image. It's very difficult to explain the role played by computers, but espionage. There are some things where, for whatever reason, a camera is not present. It's become rarer in recent years, thanks to camera phones, but it is nevertheless the case. And so there are some times when art, directly or indirectly, can convey information despite this not being a photographer's intention. This is why I really feel nervous about attaching labels to a photographer's work, because as a curator, if you sort of label something, it does tend to, it does tend to stick. And so, you can sort of see why, everybody, many of the professional photographers I've known who've covered conflict are reluctant to call themselves war photographers. And I think rightly so, because in many cases, war is not the only thing that they have photographed, and it doesn't do justice to their work and their skills. Kappa himself saw himself as a photojournalist. One of the reasons why he went into photography was because his grasp, he coming from Hungary as he did, he had a very strong accent, and he would have struggled in text or the other media forms. Photography for him was the perfect thing, but he didn't. He covered a heck of a lot of wars, but he didn't. It wasn't the only thing he did. That applies to Don McCullin. He has done so much in addition to the coverage of conflict. Interestingly, with labels, there is a tendency to substitute the word artist for photographer. And I can see why, but I feel that it's, again, doing a disservice to photography. Photography involves artistry, no doubt about it. But I think that we should acknowledge what makes photography special. And if you are curating an exhibition of photographic work, say it as it is. And I really genuinely feel that photography has often been a poor relation in many media forms. There were times when it was regarded as illustration to text. Certainly in the early days of newspapers, that was, the photographer was almost an assistant to the journalist. And he was there to actually just capture a few images which actually made the point of that the article would cover. In the first half of my career, photography in Britain was seen as a working profession. You couldn't, in those days, it was hard to do an academic qualification in photography. You were apprenticed, or you did a city and guilds, and you learnt on the job. I have to say that many photography curators, and I was one of them, also learnt on the job. None of my training at university or subsequently prepared me for a career in managing a collection of photographs. These days, there are courses and opportunities for professional training and academic study of photography coming out of every crevice you can imagine. The choice is amazing and wonderful.
And we rejoin Hilary Roberts, my guest, shortly. If you've been walking anywhere we should know about and see, send your pictures and stories to me at stories@photowalk.show. Send your pictures 2,500 pixels wide, please, whether they're portrait orientated, square or landscape. If you can send it that size, fantastic. If you can't, don't worry, I will do all together now the heavy lifting for you with image optimization if I need to do it for you. But send your stories, and not only your stories pictorially, but send me your thoughts about photography. I know that this week isn't a mailbag show, and or next week isn't so much either. although I'd say it's closer to I don't know what is a more regular format. We don't really have one, do we? We walk, we talk, we make pictures. That's what this show is all about. But please send me your thoughts about photography as well. What a difference it makes in your life. So often, mental health is an important facet and conversation. A rolling conversation of this program. I know that photography, making photographs and being in the landscape, and actually today's postscript, I shall not do a spoiler, but today's postscript perfectly encapsulates that feeling that so often we share and we talk about when we're conversing about photography and making pictures. So yeah, please let me know your thoughts about photography too. If you've been a photographer for many, many years, I'm sure you've got wonderful stories to share. Just pick one of those stories out and share it with us because it's so inspirational. If you're new, the whole point of this program, and I keep coming back to this, that it shouldn't be a program that you think, oh, I don't understand about f-stops, I don't understand about exposure triangles, I don't really know some of the names that are mentioned, I don't get the history of photography, there's so many I don'ts. But this is a program about I do, because you do make photographs, probably. You may not have a fancy DSLR, you may not have a film camera, you may not have a darkroom, you may not have a mirrorless camera, a medium format camera, and so on and so forth. You will find out in a story later on today that even those that don't think they're photographers end up making the most important pictures for generations to see. Yeah, it might be that you're somebody with an iPhone. Other flavors of smartphone are available, I appreciate, who's right at the start of this incredible adventure. Or maybe you don't intend to become any kind of photographer in your in terms of the way you describe yourself, but you enjoy making pictures. You will have stories too of places that you've traveled and been, and I'd love to know about those. So please keep sending your stories in, and your letters will be back on the show in a couple of weeks' time. I tell you what, we're going to have quite a mailbag in a few weeks' time. I will most certainly have to do an extra show, I think, to get to your letters. I love reading them so much. Let me make a picture. There's a part of the path ahead of me that's just bathed in this, in the last knockings of the sunshine. Let's put my thoughts down there, put my notes down there. Here we go. It's lovely. It's just part of the path, absolutely bathed in sunshine. Still quite chilly. It's a bit of a chill in the air. I don't need F9 because I'm not shooting into the sun. Let's select F4, 1/60th, shutter speed 420. There we go. Oh, hang on. Not sure I got the focus nailed there. We'll see how that comes out later. I know I'm back in the UK. The private planes. I tell you what, I didn't miss them last week when I was making my program, which I'll talk about in a moment, in the central part of the Alps. There were no private planes. It would have taken a fairly brave pilot to be navigating their way through the mountains where I was last week. Anyway, on that note, do you know there's 2 podcasts, or 2 photo walks a week now? Would that be the Wednesday one, the Extra Mile one? Yes, it would be. And this one, yes, the Friday Photo Walk and the Wednesday show that's available to patrons of this program, members, extra milers, as we call you. And you can become an extra miler by clicking on the website, photowalk.show. Right-hand side, you'll see a support the show button. Click on that, and you can become an extra miler and listen to that extra Wednesday show we have. Plus, we meet once a month for the InVision show on Zoom. Our own guest speakers pop up to share their stories of life with a camera. And we have a roll of 12. And there's an invite to share pictures that you've been making over the last 30 days as well.
On this week's Extra Mile.
And yes, As I've mooted already, the extra mile this week was recorded in Austria, where I've been walking the beautiful, it's the central region of the Austrian Alps. It's a show this week which is available now. It's published about many things, including privacy, because that's a worrying part of Austrian photographic culture, that it's now essentially impossible legally to do any form of street photography without gaining permission from every person in the street that is identifiable in your photograph. And my guest who I shoot the breeze with is Alex Fredriksson, who lives in Austria and knows at first hand what a difference the rules make.
Let's say that I took a picture of you and you didn't see it, but your photograph was recognised by your wife or somebody who knows you. I've still got the problem, so it doesn't have to be you who recognises it.
I think that's a fascinating, I think you'll find it a fascinating, if not worrying, with a small W at the moment, facet about photography in parts of Europe. We also talk about the environment.
Kids now, children being born now, in their lifetime, it'll be gone. It's just dead up there. It's just dead rock, dead. It's just grey. If you look at a dead glacier, it's a horrible thing to look at.
We talk about photographic projects.
The funny thing is that every click of the shutter, every picture I made me breathe a little bit easier. I always say that I didn't find photography, it found me, but out of necessity.
And my guest for the role of 12 is Andy Fisher, with the most extraordinary story.
When she went over there, she said, I don't suppose one of your birds of prey disappeared. And they went, oh yeah, Sydney, yeah. It's very unusual for Sydney. And Sydney was my father's middle name.
Say no more, Andy. Let's not have too much of a spoiler. There's lots of extraordinaries this week. I think I must have used that word a few times now. It's story after story after story on the Extra Mile this week. A bump-along edition from Austria. And you can become, as I say, an extra miler by clicking on the support the show icon on the front of the website at photowalk.show. And, thank you. Really, sincerely, thank you to all those who are making this show a weekly adventure with our cameras.
For quality used and inspected photo and video kit with a 6-month guarantee upon what you buy, visit mpb.com.
Now, it's unusual at this stage that I talk about next week's programme. I usually have that toward the end of the programme, but I'm just changing it up a bit this week, and we'll be back with Hilary Roberts in just a moment's time. Next week, I'm spending 2 days with, I'm going to say documentarian and writer Paul Hudson. And we'll be going on a photo walk adventure, which takes in historic York. There's so much to photograph and talk about there. We'll be touring and photographing what was a fishing capital once upon a time. We'll be going aboard the Ross Tiger, a deep-sea fishing trawler from the 50s. Part of the checklist next week, then, will certainly be a life vest. We'll have lunch at the famous Marples Cafe in Cleethorpes, dinner at the famous Steele's restaurant in the same town, where the infamous giant fish and chips is so giant, it's like it'll be like an edition of Man versus Food. You're essentially eating a shark on a plate, from what I've heard. Not actually a shark, obviously. I wouldn't believe in that kind of thing. But Dan Baker is also joining us. He makes these fantastic, I'm going to use that word again, actually, extraordinary, ordinary pictures of life in British seaside towns. Stories like By the Sea, Junk Shop, and Wetsuits and Pasties. Also, we'll be walking out to Forts or Flatlands, which is, I think, the closest you'll come to a desert scape south of Cleethorpes. And we'll be finishing with a pint in a typical trad Grimsby spit and sawdust pub, i.e. not a Wetherspoons. Oh, and lest I forget, he says, skipping over the part of his notes he should have spied before, Sean Tucker is joining us for breakfast on one of the days. 2 specials in a row, it seems, this week with Hilary, next week on the road. I have to say, it's a very, very, very different type of show next week. Bring your trunks. You might need them for next week's programme. Right, back to today's show. My guest is Hilary Roberts, curator, historian, photographer. And you'll remember right at the start of today's programme, I suggested she suggested to me after I was intrigued by what a curator might curate in their own home. She said she'd show me some of her photographic collection around the house. There's a lot of it, so we couldn't possibly look at it all, but we took a step through the house to look at the collection of photographs that certainly one of the UK's most important historians and curators keeps.
So, yes, we're standing in front of some of my library, curatorial library.
Some of these pictures I recognise very well.
Yeah, so up the top right there, we have a photograph by Don McCullen of Johnson Bahari, Victoria Cross, VC, and this was a photograph that I commissioned for the museum because we were working on the Victoria Cross Gallery at the same time that we were working on Don's show. And Johnson, amongst other things, had, sort of had this extraordinary tattoo of the VC on his back.
Yeah.
And so Don came along and we set this up at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. And this was the last shot of that session. Johnson just turned his head to the right, and you could see the scar on his head where he was so desperately injured in Iraq.
Goodness.
And that photograph, almost an afterthought of a long session, is the one that has been used. It's still on display. It's been on display ever since in the museum galleries, large and small. Next to it is a photograph, one of many, by a photographer who's no longer with us, Edward Barber, who I worked with. He was the one photographer who was allowed to photograph the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp.
Well, that's right on my doorstep. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in the context of this, he did a whole series of photographs about the creativity of protesters.
Yes.
And I like this one because it's got humour. So there is a bespectacled man at a CND rally in Hyde Park, and he's put a paper bag on his head on which he's written, "In the event of a nuclear attack, place bag overhead, put fingers in ears," etc., etc. And you know, it really is, you know, a sense of the creativity and the humour, but also a different perspective. We've got some exhibition posters from the shows I've worked on. This little photograph in the frame here is by another photographer friend of mine, Alison Baskerville. She was the first woman to deploy with the British Army to a war zone as a British Army photographer. And she did a 6-month tour in Afghanistan. And this photograph was on an occasion where the patrol she was with got involved in what they call a contact, but basically was an exchange of fire with the Taliban. And Alison had to, A, take photographs, and B, ultimately drop the camera and pick up her weapon and use it to defend this man. So they had literally just, fought off this attack. And the soldier is sitting exhausted. I mean, you have to remember how hot it is in Afghanistan. So that's about it.
He does look exhausted.
Yes, and Alison was in a similar state, and she took this photograph of him, and it's a selection she won an award for. So, and then we've got this photograph here. There's a familiar figure on the right-hand side, you might notice.
That's our friend Charles Penfound.
So this is a photograph which was taken, believe it or not, at my my birthday party.
Right.
And these are all army photographers, all of them. Alison is actually standing next to me there, but you've got they have photographed every conflict from the Troubles and the Civil War in former Yugoslavia, right up to Afghanistan.
Goodness.
And, between them, I struggle to actually think how many photographs of theirs that I have worked with, but, it's 5 figures easily, if not more.
Yeah. All in that one photograph.
All in that one photograph on a sunny day.
Yeah.
And they've all gone on to work professionally in photography fields.
Yeah.
Alison is currently overseeing the safety of photographers in Ukraine and other conflict zones around the world. Angus Beaton on the left went on to do an amazing body of work with a refugee charity which sought to help Yazidis and other refugees from former Iraq. So, one of the things I really value is what photographers do next.
Yeah.
Because their experiences in photographing conflict often shapes what they do next. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they end up as photographers, but it does shape, their lives. And because it shapes their lives, it shapes ours.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yes, that's...
And there's the piano as well. Do you play the piano?
I play the piano, but then this is a photograph.
On the piano?
Yes.
Ah.
This is my grandfather, and this is my great-grandfather. That is a great-uncle. So,
what's the regiment?
So this is the Bedfordshire Regiment, and my great-grandfather served in the Boer War and other places. Well, he rose to become the regiment's quartermaster, but it was a very musical family, and they all played instruments. I mean, today we've got 3 trombonists in the family, but my great-uncle emigrated to Canada, and he went on to become second in command of the Canadian Expeditionary Force on D-Day.
Oh, wow. Good.
None of which means that I actually directly have a military family, because none of us, I never actually knew my grandfather. He died very young. But the family I basically sort of working with the military is about the closest that we've come.
But everything has a place in here, and you've curated that photograph to go with your music, the music side of the room.
Well, moving through this photograph here, this photograph is by an anonymous press photographer who scooped Cecil Beaton.
And I see a lot of Cecil Beaton actually in your bookcase. Yeah.
Well, several reasons for that. One is that the museum has his collection of Second World War photographs, but significantly I worked on 2 major shows. One in 1980-81, just after his death, which was the first time those photographs had ever been given a show of their own. And secondly, in 2012, when I looked at how his sense of theatre played into his conflict photographs. But this photograph we're looking here is a standard Second World War era 8x6 inch press print, which has got the photo editor's cropping marks surrounding it. And it shows the belfry of St Paul's Cathedral in London on the night after that enormous raid on the City of London, when everybody will have seen this film. St Paul's itself survived, and the surroundings didn't. And Cecil Beaton was working on a book at the time, and he went down there and he saw this shot and he took it, and he was intending to use it in his book, History Under Fire. And the photographer who took this particular image saw what he was doing, stepped into his place, and because he was a newspaper photographer, took exactly the same photograph and scooped him. And Cecil Beaton's diaries sort of
does he mention it?
He mentions it. He was really annoyed. But
fantastic.
There are 1 or 2. So this is one of Giles Penfound's photographs. I find, Giles Penfound is a wonderful photographer. So Giles was in the British Army and then became a British Army photographer, and was, amongst many other things, the first and the leading stills photographer to accompany the British Army into Iraq in 2003. He takes the most beautiful black and white photographs, wide variety of subjects, but this is a photograph which is almost pictorialist in style.
Yeah.
And
it's very painterly.
It is. It shows a swan sort of on a dark lake with a background of trees in the mist, and it's a very peaceful image. But
I've never seen this image before, and I think Giles has shown me all his images, but clearly not. He's holding some back.
Well,
you've got that one.
Giles did this wonderful thing, which I thought was really imaginative. He staged an exhibition on his garden fence.
Yeah.
And this was one of the images that I saw on his garden fence, and I thought, I need to buy that one.
Is this one of one then?
Yes.
Yes, it is. Yeah, both of us looking at the picture.
So yes, that's that one.
One of one.
Yes.
Fantastic.
This one up here is by Lee Miller, who I also curated. Yeah. This is one of her photographs using what she called the solarization technique, and it's of one of the female surrealist artists. And surrealism as an art movement was unusual at the time in that it included women. Yeah. Most art movements were male only, but that particular photograph the print dates from the pandemic, because the pandemic had a devastating financial impact on, all cultural institutions, but privately supported small archives, such as the Lee Miller Archive, which has no grants. Right. It's entirely self-supporting. So they had to, in 2020, raise funds literally to survive. And in return for donations, they gave donors a print. So that print is not only a memory of one of my favourite Lee Miller photographs, which is nothing to do with war, but it's also a memory of the fight to survive during the pandemic.
A curator's house.
A curator's house, indeed. So, it all goes on, really, I'm afraid. My daughter and her brother is going to have a hell of a time sorting it out at the end of all of this, I think.
You formed some strong friendships as you've been, as I would imagine, over 40 years of curating some of the a lot of the most important pictures that photographers, certainly British photographers, have made. You've made friendships with Don McCullin, for instance. I'm always surprised, and I dare say you will have a take on this, that he openly expresses a feeling that his pictures haven't necessarily changed anything. That suffering continues, war continues, conflicts continue. Nobody necessarily learned any lessons insofar as that they might stop these things happening. And I wonder how your perception of this feeling may differ, or maybe you support that feeling.
So I first encountered Don's work as a child. My parents took the Sunday Times, and just going back to the point I made earlier about a picture embedding itself in your consciousness, some of his covers from his various wars did impress themselves on my very young memory. I had no idea where Vietnam was, who Don McCullin was, really any of the context to any of that, but the images stayed there. I can even remember some of his colour images from that time. So I first encountered Don McCullin's work before I encountered Don himself. Don won't remember my first meeting with him, but that was when he came into the Imperial War Museum in 1982. The hope was that IWM could commission him to cover the Falklands conflict.
Because he didn't go.
That's right, and that's a long story in itself. But the fact was that, yes, he he came not galloping, but rushing down the corridor. He had his arm in a sling because he had injured himself falling off a roof in El Salvador. And he had a face like thunder at that point. I think he was hurting, and B, he had a very frustrating day. But it was quite clear to me that nothing was going to stop his progress. And I was carrying 2 armloads of photographs. I basically said "eek" and leapt out of his way, and he went straight on past. And that was the first time I'd seen how fast he could move, how determined he was. Our paths crossed several times after that, but it was not until 2010-11 that I was actually able to do a proper project with him. Every time we tried to do something else got in the way. But I curated an exhibition of his work, which was called Shaped by War for Imperial War Museum, and it was displayed around the country. In the course of researching that and subsequently, the fallout and the legacy of the exhibition, we've got to know each other pretty well. I am privileged to call him a friend. The nice thing, I think, is that we can both talk about photography, but also we can talk from a position of knowledge and experience about conflict.
Yes.
And so, as a friend, I always enjoy, the to and fro with him about sort of, some aspect of a conflict and why it happened and what the photography and the challenges involved were. Even if he wasn't there, he has a very considered and informed opinion. So, he is one of my friends, and I'm very grateful for that. In terms of his photographs, whether his photographs making a difference, that is one of our debates. It's a humorous, friendly exchange in which he will say, "I don't consider my photographs have made a difference," and then I will reel off a whole set of things, including the fact that we're actually having this conversation as to why it's made a difference. But you have to contextualize where he's coming from on that, because he is talking about the conflicts of the 1960s and the 1970s. He is talking about a form of activism in photography. And, at this point, that activism was spread throughout popular culture. So music, film, art. That the 60s generation wanted a better world. We were living in the shadow of the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, memories of the Second World War and everything that had gone with that. And photography at that point was working independently, and it was working in a way to comment as opposed to illustrate. And so the idea that you could not only tell the story, but you could make a case for change was very much part of that period. And it was a genuine hope amongst the creative people who were working in that way at that time that what they were doing would make a difference, and that at least the Vietnam War could be ended, and that somehow we could get out from under the threat of nuclear Armageddon. John Lennon's songs, Give Peace a Chance, all of this, and many of the contemporary art of that period, all of the same thing. So Don was part of that. He also saw at first hand far too much of the consequences of conflict, starting with obviously Cyprus and Vietnam, where many of his images focus on, if you like, the combat, if you like, the Hollywood stuff, but always aware of the consequences. And then Biafra, where the famine is a consequence. And his growing awareness of the consequences, the fact that it's not just the ones with weapons in combat, but it's also those that haven't, who are caught up. So you know, I would argue very strongly that Don McCullen's photographs have made a difference.
Does he cede to that? That might be too private for you to admit.
Well, let's say we agree. We disagree, I think, on that one. But yeah, my genuine belief is that his photographs have made a difference. But the question about whether any photograph can stop a conflict is, I think, something that we agree on. Yeah. I don't think any single photograph could stop fighting. All it can do is raise awareness, and in a multimedia landscape, you need more than just photographs to make that difference. Ultimately, the only thing that stops conflict is talking and finding some way of reaching an accommodation. And the problem with stopping a long-established conflict, which may have been years in the making, is that over time, the opponent, the enemy, is dehumanized and demonized. And in order to, resolve that, you have to restore their humanity, and you have to find a way of coming to terms with what has been done. Civil wars, for that reason, when you're living in close proximity to your opponent, are some of the hardest to resolve in the long term.
I wonder, it's interesting you talk about the dehumanizing aspect of, and in this case, the context is photography. I personally find the graphic nature of photography, which we see far more of than ever we did. Some of the softer images have perhaps affected me in terms of empathy and the mental empathy far more. And if we bring it right up to date with Ukraine, the pictures of children with their hands on the glass of the train to their father's hands the other side as they leave the station and father stays behind. That to me is a conflict photograph as such has definitely left more of an imprint on me over the last couple of years, the last year in particular.
I think this is a very important point, that each generation is exposed to imagery in a different form, potentially, and the extent to which it is new and novel has the power to make an impression, or if it is not new and novel, it is that sort of, it's got to reach you personally, hasn't it? Yeah. And at a time when we are surrounded by photographs of every sort, it can go in two ways. It can go in the way of the exceedingly graphic, which I think has a limited effectiveness, I'm afraid. It has the power to shock, but unfortunately, very quickly one comes to, one deals with that. Yeah. So in the early days of the conflict in Ukraine, we had work by some very well-known, very experienced photographers who did wonderful work, but the images that were picked up and carried from them were particularly graphic. And then we have the images which strike a chord for other reasons. And I think empathy is a very, very powerful thing. The fact that, this could be you. One of the most disturbing memories I have about the photography from the siege of Sarajevo is the fact that here you had what looked to be a modern city, people who were fashionably dressed. Yes. Yeah. They were being reduced to these most primitive of conditions in the most dreadful circumstances. Ukraine, I've been to Ukraine. I was in Ukraine on the eve of fighting breaking out at the end of 2013, early 2014. I saw the protests in Maidan at first hand. I had no idea until I came out from the underground station at Maidan that there was anything going on, because nobody hadn't told me and it hadn't featured in British news. And I came out, there was the Maidan, which was a national monument, which I had expected to see, surrounded by, the square was filled with people of all ages, including children in pushchairs, many of them with EU flags. And it was a peaceful demonstration. And then I walked around the corner to where the President's Palace was, and there were troops in riot gear protecting the President. And the day I left was the day that the first person died, and it was the day that the President fled and went to Russia. So that brief visit to Kyiv and talking to the Ukrainians themselves have engaged me and have meant that the photographs of the conflict in Ukraine have a different resonance. They're not a war at a distance. For me, they involve people that I came to know and a lifestyle that I came to know. And the complexities, until you've actually heard one Ukrainian call another Ukrainian a Nazi, you think, what? And then you sort of look at the history and you think, and the question there is, can any single photograph encapsulate that story? And that is the challenge that faces the photographers who are doing an amazing job in Ukraine. At the moment, IWM has an exhibition of Anastasia Taylor-Lynn's photographs from Ukraine, in which she's worked in Ukraine for that period of time that I'm talking about here. So from the Maidan protests up to the present day, those photographs at the moment, for me, confirm what I already know, but they don't tell me any more yet.
Hilary, you mentioned 2 letters, of which, do you know, I know and I knew of AI for quite a while, but it only seems to me over the last couple of months, it's almost like that the demon has sort of knocked at my door, and it is saying, I could well be affecting this thing that you love very much, photography. And I'm worried, with a small w at the moment, but it could be capitalizing, that the authenticity is going to be the issue with AI, and in particular, the authenticity when it comes to conflict, because I need to believe my eyes. Now, I know photographers can make you think different things through virtue of an angle of a picture, whether that be a physical angle, a low, a high, or whatever angle. But if I can't believe what's really happening in the picture, will I stop believing in photography?
And I would add to your question, if I don't want to believe. But yes, I think we've been here before. Really? With regard to the advent of Photoshop and the ability to alter images in a way which is not necessarily immediately obvious to the human eye. I think AI offers both threats and opportunities. It has strengths and weaknesses. And I think we have a personal responsibility, there's that word again, to look at the photographs that we see and think about them more than maybe we do on a day-to-day basis. When the ability to significantly manipulate photographs by adding or removing content, came along, I think it was 2002, 2003 that I was part of a working party to try and establish a way of actually dealing with this in my particular field. What became very clear was that one had to take personal responsibility for the interpretation that you placed upon a photograph and the way in which you used it. Now, there are techniques that one can use, which are not new. I mentioned earlier that the First World War was the era in which the truth and integrity of an image first became of paramount importance. It was recognized at that point that if you wanted your images to be believed, you had to follow a policy which was known then as the propaganda of the facts. In other words, if you manipulated or falsified, which is even more serious, falsified the content of your images, then you risked undermining the cause that you were hoping to engender support for. The motivation of people to falsify images is often commercial. In other words, I want to make money. If this is the only way I can get published, then I will do it. Another is ideological. In other words, they have a point that they wish to get across. It can be creative. Here's a wonderful bag of tricks. Let's just see what we can do with it. Mm-hmm. So, one of the key things about any imagery in terms of conflict is to pay attention to who the photographer was, what their motivation was, and this is often forgotten, what is the motivation and the agenda of the distributor of that photograph. Conflict photographs have been manipulated pretty much since the first days when people took cameras out to a battlefield. That's nothing new. But what has become apparent as technology has progressed is that it's no longer enough to rely on your eyes. You have to look into the context of a photograph and its history. The same applies to AI. I'm interested to see where AI takes us, but I really would make the same argument that I've always made, which is that the audience has just as much responsibility as the photographer or their publisher. And we owe it to ourselves to equip ourselves with a questioning mind, but also some skills to ask obvious questions, who, what, where, when, why. Particularly in the context of social media, because, two things there. It's also resist the temptation to sort of click and share first and think later. Yeah. Think first, click later. But also, so many photographs are these days seen on a very small screen, the phone. Take some time to actually look at the larger version and look at the detail.
Because around the picture.
Yes. Learn how to look at a picture.
Yeah.
And think about what you're seeing. Does it all add up? So often, a phone picture, the detail is there, the clues are there, but the screen is so small that you could miss them at a first glimpse.
You've handed your Rolodex at IWM. If indeed you were using one, there's a memory onto whoever has now taken that mantle of responsibility. But as you said right at the start, so this comes full circle, you've not stopped curating. You're now, in fact, involved locally, closer to home, helping those in local newspapers to understand the significance and the importance of archiving and curation.
Yes, I'm continuing to work in photography, and I'm continuing to work in conflict photography, and that's they say curators never retire. No. So that's a given. But I also now have an opportunity to sort of investigate new things, and one of those new things is helping my local community. Now, we're very lucky here in Farnham, where I live, to have a newspaper which was established in the 19th century.
Right.
And it is not only a Farnham newspaper, but it has various titles under the Tyndall newspaper group, which cover Sussex, Surrey, and parts of Hampshire. Yeah. And there is a vast amount of newsprint, and there is photography. Just before the pandemic started, the newspaper began to, it took stock and it realised that it, rather to its surprise, it had an archive. And also that the local community, when it published examples from its archive, responded very well to features and photographs from past editions. Anyway, the hope with the project that I'm dealing with is to, first of all, make sure that this archive is preserved. Secondly, to make it accessible. And Also, to actually remind people that local history is also national history.
Yes.
It is quite extraordinary how much you can learn from reading the pages of a local newspaper, particularly in the days which predated other news mediums, because local newspapers often carried national news. They certainly tell you an enormous amount about the way of life of ordinary people. History is full of the stories of the great and the good and the exceptional, but what is often less written is the stories of everyday life, how people led those lives. So I have found this project absolutely fascinating, but it also, as I said, there is a resource there which I think would be actually internationally of interest. So my hope is I'm working with the newspaper and a small steering group of volunteers to develop a project by which the newspaper itself can be digitized and made available online, which means that people not only in the UK but in other countries can actually search it and read it. And the first step of it has been to establish what the archive actually consists of, and that is almost complete now. And we are working with the British Library, which is the national custodian of the UK's newspapers, to work out a way forward to digitise this resource. So it's a very enjoyable one, but it also, it draws on some of my experience because this newspaper appeared during multiple wars. But at the same time, I'm learning an awful lot. And really, as a curator, the thirst for knowledge is always there.
I like this, actually. I'm going to be able to counter my wife now, who might say, "You're hoarding." I'm simply going to come back and say, "No, Hilary taught me that I'm curating."
As long as you are selectively curating and you're making decisions, then yes, you are indeed curating.
I'm going to ask you one impossible question at the end, and you might say, "I'll come back to you on that." And if you do, that opens the door for me to ask you more questions in the future. In all your 4 decades of curating at the Imperial War Museum, has there been a photograph or something you've been curating, so it might not be a photograph actually, where you've thought, "Whew, that's taken my breath away. I wasn't quite expecting that"?
There have been lots of photographs that have done that,
I dare say.
good and bad. And I think it's very hard. It's always very hard to come up with just one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a collection, which is a collection of a couple of hundred photographs, which were put together in quite extraordinary circumstances. And this was the collection of a young man who was serving with the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. His name was William Lawrence. He was a Yorkshireman, and Yorkshiremen are very determined, not to say sometimes stubborn individuals. But this young man was shot down and badly injured and ended up in a prisoner of war camp. And his injuries meant that attempting to escape from a prisoner of war camp, it wasn't for him. And so he took it upon himself to find a way of creating a photographic record of life in the camp. The record, he thought, would serve as evidence, but it would also record a personal experience. And he started out making a pinhole camera.
Wow.
You have to remember he was not a trained photographer.
Yeah.
This is what the wonderful thing about photography, and certainly black and white film photography, that with a little bit of technical now, so you can do the basics. But he got some Australian and New Zealand friends who remained lifelong friends, fellow prisoners, to steal X-ray film and chemicals from the camp hospital.
Goodness.
And he turned his camp bed after lights out into a homemade darkroom. And so with these rudimentary materials, he created a record of life in a prisoner of war camp. And the record covers every aspect. It covers the tedium, it covers the conditions, it covers the highlights and the creativity, all the ways that prisoners found to pass time. Yeah. And in the context of this experience, he was never detected in this activity. He took photographs, identity photographs of prisoners which could serve on fake documents when they escaped. So he took photographs of them wearing uniforms which had been converted to civilian clothing, right, which could be put on ID papers and so forth. And he also photographed mistreatment. And in the context of this, one day he was discovered by a Ukrainian guard who, coming back to the complexities of the war in Ukraine, who was particularly brutal, and he had a severe beating about the head with the butt of the guard's rifle. At the end of the war, he brought his photographs home. He was debriefed and kept the photographs, and he aspired to become a professional photographer. And indeed, he managed to, but very shortly after he had established his business, his sight began to go. Oh. And that was connected very much to the beating that he had received. Mm. When I was, at one point in the 80s, he called the museum. I happened to be the one who picked up the phone. And he told me this story, and it sounded so far-fetched that I could barely believe it. Yeah. At the time, I was helping Spike Milligan with his biography, and Spike was quite inclined to make joke calls. And so, I thought, hang on, this is a Spike Milligan. Yeah. But no, it turned out to be completely genuine. The amazing memory that I have is of sitting with him with his collection of negatives, which had all been cut from X-ray film. Yeah. And, he couldn't see, but he could feel around the edges of the negatives, and he would tell me precisely what they showed. And he would also tell me the exposure time, shutter speed, and all the other technical details. And we became great friends. There was a standing joke whereby he, as a Yorkshireman, careful with money, and he used to phone up and try to reverse the charges of the call. And the museum's policy in those days was that we didn't accept that. So the head of security would phone me up and say, "Mr. Lawrence on the line again, Hillary, can you call him?" There we go. So, he's long gone, but the photographs they have been used many, many times. But for me personally, that story is an extraordinary one. I will just conclude with a final memory. Long after his death, I was giving a talk in Bradford, and I showed one of his photographs in the context of others, and there was a young student in the back who suddenly sat up straight and went very pale, and came up afterwards and told me that this was her great-uncle. Wow. About whose experiences she knew absolutely nothing. And for me, that is both the thrill and the importance of the job.
I've used the word so much in today's program. I'm going to use it one more time. An extraordinary story to end on, and my thanks sincerely to Hilary Roberts for being our special guest this week on a very different kind of Photowalk show. I think you'll agree. Very different. I do hope, because there was very much a sort of a UK feeling in many respects to today's programme, or UK sound, and certainly the clips that you heard would be historically potent and important when it comes to UK politics and news. But I do hope that it connected with you wherever you are in the world. And as I As I mooted at the start, of course, in some parts of the world that aren't necessarily as peaceful as I'm fortuitously able to enjoy in my own life at this particular moment. For links to what we've talked about today, go to photowalk.show or follow the link in the podcast player app that will also take you there. It's in your app. You'll see it there. Not all apps, as I said a couple of weeks ago, manage to make their links work. It seems that Google has a problem on their podcast player, but most podcast players, I think, perfectly behave themselves, and you can link through to the page on the Photowalk website today. I'm just going to make another picture actually before we close. There's these wonderful roots that are, it's almost like the roots of mangroves that you see that lift themselves out of the riverbanks. And you see the complete root structure, which is not something that I'm used to seeing in trees. This particular tree here, I don't know what it is. I shall look up on my app in a moment's time. Right, F4. Oh, it's lovely golden light at the moment, 1/40th. Wow, look at that. There's another one here, actually. Unfortunately, I can't seem to get myself with what is effectively a 35mm lens here. I can't get myself out of the picture. And what I'm not looking for is a picture that matches our assignment, which is about street self-portraits this particular month. One more. There we go. Not sure I managed to get myself out of that picture. Let's pick up the notes. Next week we're in York. Oh, I'm so looking forward to that. Couple of days away. It's going to be a bit whirlwind. I can see a very late night editing next Thursday for the release of Friday morning, but I'm so looking forward to it. I sense we're going to have a few laughs on that program indeed. And then in a couple of weeks' time, no doubt we're going to have a bumper letters show. Thoughts from you. Our play-out song today, the song that we walk with just a few more moments, making some pictures at the end of today's programme, is from James Forrest. It's called My Peaceful Games, which links reasonably well, perhaps perfectly, with a postscript to today's show, which comes from a photographer you know I have a dear affection for, as does my guest today, Hilary Roberts, as do thousands upon thousands of photographers. Now, I would imagine many thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of non-photographers, if you will, who've been moved by his pictures, who may not be aware of him by his byline or even know of his genius, but they'll know how they feel when they view or viewed his photographs. So this week's postscript to the show is a thought from Don McCullin, who has witnessed scenes through his lens that practically everybody listening today will never have to view firsthand. But then he comes home and he makes just the most incredible landscape pictures. And it's a quote about his time spent with his camera in those moments that I want to close with today. I like photographing the English landscape in the winter because it's naked and it's cold and it's lonely. And I feel lonely doing it. And yes, I feel as happy as anything. There's no politics, there's no one saying, get off my land. There's no one pointing a gun at me. It's almost as if I'm drinking from the flower, as if I'm drinking the pure nectar of freedom.
Go and take a walk in the snow. It is medicine for the soul. So much in my head these days. In the winter sky could fly away. stand. My search for freedom, my peaceful gaze. People don't seem to understand. All make perfect sense. Destination doesn't really matter. As much as the road to get there. Gonna take a walk in the snow. It's just like a prayer. People seem to understand. My search for freedom, my peaceful games. To understand, but to me it all make perfect sense. Perfect sense.
James Forrest with My Peaceful Games. And that's it for this week. My thanks once more to Hilary Roberts for this, I think, history special. The Extra Mile is out, and a reminder that this week it's an Austrian special, featuring my guest Alex Frederiksen, who lives and photographs in Austria, plus a wonderful roll of 12 featuring last week's guest Andy Fisher, who's about to bivvy his way across mountain ranges in the UK this summer. So go across now to hear that, or of course you can walk with me while you listen at the weekend. Next week, join me, the street photographers and documentarians Paul Hudson and Dan Baker, plus philosophical YouTuber Sean Tucker in the northwest of England. I have my passport and Aaron jumper at the ready. Final virtual fist bumps go to Neil Ford, head of stuff that only works after he's given it a reboot. Emily Renier for your eyes in our Facebook group, and Andrea Gilpin, Chief of Staff on the Instagram and Ideas floor, to Artlist, to Epidemic for the music, and I look forward to photographing with you, hearing from you and talking with you next time.
The Photowalk is a Loading Zone production.